Hello and welcome. We'll wait a few seconds while people join and get settled, and we'll start very shortly. Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us. Good afternoon from Dublin, Ireland, from unexpectedly sunny Dublin. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you're connecting from. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be talking about the findings from a social protection systems diagnostic, the experience in Uzbekistan using CODI. Before I get started introducing our speakers today, I would like to thank socialprotection.org for hosting us today. And now let me welcome and introduce our speakers and my esteemed colleagues today. If I can get control of the screen. Today we have Marina Novikova and Nadia Krizio. Thank you both for joining us and participating today. Marina is a social protection specialist based in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. She is currently working in both Uzbekistan and Kyrgyz Republic, focusing mainly on social system reforms, the development of single registries and labor market IT systems, active labor market programs, and the disaster responsive social protection agenda in the Central Asia region, and is the task team leader for the social protection response to the pandemic in Uzbekistan. She has also experience in other regions and countries, including Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Belarus, and Russia. Hi, Marina. Thank you for joining us. We also have Adea Krizio connecting from DC. Adea is a social protection specialist at the World Bank, where she has worked on many topics. The most notable include the social protection linkages to climate change, disaster risk management, and energy subsidy reform. She has worked in West Africa, East Asia and Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and she is the co-lead of the ISPA coordination team that is jointly led by the ILO and the World Bank. And she has also led applications of CODI in fragile settings. Hi, Adan, thank you for joining us. And last but not least, let me introduce myself. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Veronica Lopez. I'm my consultant at the World Bank and have been in social protection since 2012. I'm also part of the ISPA team, and I'm currently on 2 working groups developing forthcoming tools on social assistance cash transfers and social information systems. That was pretty fast. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. Please, just as a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available for you to review at a later date on the socialprotection.org website. Also, please feel free to ask any questions. We encourage all questions. Please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to clarify any clarifying questions during the presentation. If not, we'll save some space at the end of the presentation to go and over all of them. And another reminder, you can find CODI and all of the other ISPA tools on the ISPA website, ispatools.org. You're also invited to interact with the webinar through Twitter. And I will do my best at timekeeping, so apologies in advance to my colleagues in case I interrupt you with time updates. So now on to the main event. Just a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. Adele will do a brief description of what CODI, or the core diagnostic instrument, is. And then we'll do a deep dive on the experience in Uzbekistan. Marina will walk us through the context, what the process was like, including how stakeholders were identified and how the team came together, the scope in which the tool was used for the analysis, and then she'll share some of the main findings, recommendations, and the take-up by the government and the country's social protection response to the pandemic. So without further ado, Adele, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Veronica. And thank you to everyone for joining. Before we continue with today's presentation, I wanted to mention that we did have one last week as well, which was more general on CODI. So looking at the tool in a bit more thorough sense and in a bit more general sense. And today we will be concentrating on using this tool in a country application. And we're all very excited to hear from Marina. Uzbekistan is a very interesting country to hear from. And it's one of the most recent applications that was done. It is available in our ispatools.org website. And I will ask one of the isp.org colleagues if they can send the link because the meeting last week, July 29th, was recorded. And today I'll only go briefly through, oh, thank you. They already pasted it. Today I'll only briefly go through the CODI tool and with more information will be found on the webinar from last week. Just as an introduction of what we're talking about, the ISPA tools have been created actually by over 20 organizations working together to come up with assessments that will help governments better understand where their programs, delivery systems, and overall social protection systems stand. And the CODI tool is the one that looks at the system overall. And the objectives are to map the social protection system, so have a mapping of the schemes that are existing in the programs, look at all the delivery chains that exist per program, look at the legal aspect, look at the institutional aspect. So it's a very thorough review. It has been commended for being a really good reference tool, as well as a big, thorough analysis of what the country has at its disposal. Through these tools, countries or development partners with countries, of course, can analyze how the social protection system is performing. There's a set of criteria that have been developed with over 20 social protection experts. This part took the longest time, I believe, to develop because it's so important to have these assessments be as inclusive and as unbiased and as useful at the end of the day for whoever is conducting the assessment to help the national policy dialogue, to help any reform efforts that the government has, or to help with any of the objectives that the government has introduced at the beginning before undertaking such an assessment. The findings from the CODI tool, usually it's a big country report, and Marina will talk about this in a bit, serves as a point of entry for country dialogue, often with donors that are working together on the ground. So it helps also donors coordinate, bring together what they know so far, where they see the country going, and of course, working in collaboration with the government, they try to concentrate on the things that the government is currently working on. Now, it's important to note that this tool is by no means meant to compare countries with one another. It is, however, a tool to allow the country to see any points of entry for strengthening their programs or the legal system or specific aspects of the delivery chain that correspond to each program. So in a way, it's a snapshot of where the country stands with respect to the whole social protection sector. And it's also able to be adapted. And Marina will talk about this as well. While it is a big tool, there's also ways of concentrating on specific aspects of the entire social protection world, because that can be a big undertaking. All of this depends on what the objectives of the government going forward are and what they want to concentrate on. And as I mentioned before, it's actually one of the best ways of ensuring that the partners on the ground are coordinated, because we all have different mandates. These tools are not World Bank tools. We are one of the co-chairs, along with ILO, of maintaining the website and maintaining this partnership. But there are many, many partners that belong here. And let's say WFP can take the lead in utilizing this tool in the country, and they go through cash working groups as one way, or social policy dialogue working groups, and ensure that other partners are not doing the same work, but join forces and do it together. And the main idea behind these tools is to keep in mind that there is a theory of change. So the idea behind using those tools is to have an inventory of what exists in the country, as we mentioned, look at how these existing programs and the existing system is faring against the benchmarks that have been developed. So looking at best practices from the world, how is this, what are the points of entry that can be improved or strengthened or adapted or changed, not compared, but looking at what is the ideal and what can be achieved with the means available. And hopefully these tools help assist the teams in having the policy with the government, and ideally leads to change in the social protection system itself. This can be changing the complete objective of a program because it has to adapt to better objectives, merging programs, reactivating old programs. This also happens where, this assessment finds that, okay, there was an old program that has been deactivated, but it used to reach a really good number of beneficiaries for this objective. Maybe we can use that one or piggyback it with another program. So it's a good way of also within the government, there can be programs that are implemented from different agencies. We've seen this in many countries, and it can be a very good way of sort of having the different ministries and agencies see what is available and see what can complement one another. And ideally, as we all work towards social and economic impact of these programs. The CODI tool is one of the tools that ISPA has at its disposal. This is the tool that looks at the system overall. We have other tools that look at programs, such as Public Works tool, the upcoming cash transfers tool. We have the tool on food security that was recently published that is available on the website. Then we have tools that look at specific aspects of the delivery chain, such as the identification systems, payment systems, and there's a new exciting upcoming one on the social information systems. So as you can see from this slide, the CODI tool is the one that looks at everything. So it starts from the policy environment, it looks at every program, and then concentrates on program implementation, what we call now the delivery chain. So, first it looks at what is there available on the legal and policy framework that will help or hinder anything that has to do with program and implementation aspects. So it gives a broad view of what exists in the country and then delves into the details of the programs. Now, when we do a CODI, and then Marina will talk about this in more detail, we tend to concentrate on several programs only. So we put our efforts on, let's say, 5 programs that exist in the country. We don't look at all 20 of them because that may take about 10 years. So again, depending on the objectives that the government has set forth and has agreed with the partners that are conducting this, you concentrate on the main 5 programs that you will go into more detail on. And then for each of those programs, you look at the implementation aspects. And this is just a brief look at the criteria we mentioned before that took a while to be carefully thought through and carefully decided upon, because we wanted to make sure that it looks at as many aspects of the system as possible. And it's also important to inform everyone that this tool is also being updated at the moment. We are in the process of adding modules to the tool, so specific modules to the existing tool that look at disability, gender, and the shock responsiveness aspect. So the tool in itself, the criteria will remain the same, but we are trying to update it as much as possible with where social protection is heading, and also based on the demand. And so for everyone attending today, if there are other questions that you have, if there are other ideas, if you have heard of the tool being applied partially or in full, please let us know. The best way we keep track of the usefulness of the tool is through the feedback.
Thank you, Adaya. Now we'll hear a little bit about from Marina about the experience using the tool. Marina, could you tell us a little bit about what were some of the key findings, challenges, lessons from your experience? The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Adea and Veronica. And very nice seeing everyone and some of the familiar names I see also in the list of participants. Yeah, as Adea mentioned, I think I was just laughing when she was saying that, you know, if you try to analyze all the programs, it might take 10 years. We managed in 2. But I think if we had a subtitle, like a informal name of the title of our report, it would be, can you have it all or not with a CODI assessment? Because we went for the full assessment, we used everything that exists, and we really tried to, but I'll talk about this in details. So just to give you a little bit of a country context where we were operating when starting this ambitious process, Uzbekistan has launched on this very comprehensive transition to the market economy in 2017. And that in turn brought a lot of attention to the social protection agenda, because of course, when shifting to market economy, you need to have strong tools which are capable of supporting the population, not only in the existing setting, but also to prepare them for the not only during changes, but also to prepare them for the future of what the labor market and the economy is going to look like. Having said that, around 2018, there was a knowledge gap on the performance of the social protection system. There was essentially no comprehensive assessment of how the social protection system was performing, what existed. There was no publication where in one place that would have been done. And yet there were commitments, national and international commitments, as you can see from the slide, from the government to prioritize the social protection and the protection of vulnerable people. So as a result, we ended up focusing on CODI and using CODI to do the social protection system assessment to inform the development of national social protection strategy, to have an overview of the social protection system, to inform the context of the reform making process, help stakeholder assess priorities, consolidate social protection policies within the government, but also across different stakeholders, and do all of these things in a very, very rapidly changing environment that Uzbekistan is. Next, please. So in terms of the process and a bit of a timeline, the World Bank recognized this knowledge gap in 2018 and mobilized resources from the RSR Multi-Donor Trust Fund specifically to conduct this comprehensive assessment of a social protection system using CODI tools. We had a buy-in from the government, the ministry, both Ministry of Employment and Labor Relationship and the Ministry of Finance agreed to collaborate on this and do the assessment jointly. And then we reached out to UNICEF and ILO as the partners being most active and present in the social protection sphere in Uzbekistan to conduct this assessment jointly to maximize each agency's strength and build on the existing dialogue together. And then just to pause for a second, we'll talk a bit more about the lessons learned and everything, but just looking back at what turned out to be a couple years of work, even a little bit more, some of the strength of this very comprehensive approach was that we were able to utilize each agency's strength, policy dialogue, knowledge, and engagement. And of course, what was challenging is that the coordination takes time. It's not that even the coordination itself, but rather we had to allow sufficient amount of time to organize all the necessary workshops and align our internal meaning international community, internal visions of the development and the recommendations and understanding of the sector. And then, of course, when you have 3 agencies participating in such a thorough process, you have internal quality controls that are separate for each of the agencies, which is also taking time. But then as a result, you have this 130-page long, very comprehensive, almost a Bible of social protection system in Uzbekistan. Next, please. Next, because next one is called process, because I'm planning to talk about how we organize the process. So first of all, this was a very collaborative 2 years, both with stakeholders, with the line ministries that are listed here, and the assessment team comprising World Bank, ILO, and UNICEF. And you can see the assessment team composition and a very lovely picture of the assessment team. But what the left column of the key stakeholders is supposed to tell you is that there is no single agency, and still in 2021, there is no single agency in charge of social protection in Uzbekistan. And as a result, in all this consultation processes, you have to get all these ministries, and these are just the main ones. There are more. There's now a Ministry of Mahala, for example, which is a community level, a ministry of a community level development, let's say, and they're in charge of, in social protection terms, the social care services. They're the ones present on the ground and that are able to navigate the facing the client, the beneficiaries of the programs. So there's actually more, but these are just the key stakeholders that you need to bring on board, coordinate with, consult with, and get their feedback on. And then we had the assessment team. You can see the next, please. So the next slide shows the timeline of the process, starting from the government endorsement of the proposal in 2018, February 2018, and then in March we agreed with UNICEF and ILO to work jointly on this. We created the implementation plan, we divided work across the agencies, and we started the process. We started with a kickoff workshop in the World Bank office that was still possible back then, end of May 2018. And it was aimed at presenting the methodology. This was the workshop with the counterparts, the assessment team, international team, and the counterparts. So we presented the methodology, we explained how CODI functions, what will be required from the counterparts, etc. We discussed some preliminary activities based on the information collected at that point. We got their feedback. We had a very good participation from the Ministry of Finance, Pension Fund, Ministry of Labor, Health, Education, some of the think tanks. So this was the kickoff workshop. Then the data collection using the CODI questionnaire started. And then in this, the process was organized that each of the agencies has dedicated consultants. We essentially divided the social, we did a desk review and then interviews with the main ministries in charge of different social protection programs. We collected, so to speak, a comprehensive list of social protection programs, which we then sort of divided by areas between the three agencies so that we can work more in depth in each of these areas and do the description, performance analysis, etc. So the World Bank had the social pensions and low-income family allowances. There are 3 low-income family allowances, which are the main means, the 3 of them combined is kind of the main means tested social assistance program. Then UNICEF was doing the overall social protection policy analysis, whether it exists and how it functions, and then social services for children analysis. And then labor market policies and social services for adults were with the ILO. Following this, in November 2018, we organized a 2-day consultation workshop out of Tashkent with the counterparts. And I will talk about it in a minute in the next slide. But so far, just to say that this was to discuss the preliminary findings that the assessment team found so far and present them to the stakeholders to get their vision, their feedback. And then we also wanted to conduct this SP system assessment using the assessment matrix at this workshop by the counterparts. And this was also really well represented event, 30 participants, actually more than 30 participants from all the line ministries. And on top of that, the Women's Committee, think tanks, Federation of Trade Unions, and other international organizations. And then the process of drafting the report started. which we all did the 3 agencies. And then we also had the quality review process that I mentioned for all the agencies, the feedback collection from the government stakeholders. And actually here, I have to say that I haven't put it here because it's already a very heavy slide, but we had another smaller workshop during the CODI report drafting for the assessment team. So World Bank, ILO, and UNICEF staff and consultants working on this report met during the report preparation. We met in Tashkent and then we had several online discussions as well. We had this face-to-face workshop because we needed to bring this together, right? We had a lot of information and we had a lot of material to work with, and we had the initial draft, but we had to agree and align on the main recommendations and main findings and recommendations. And because this was a very, very thorough report, we didn't pick on the different programs. We did the system assessment as a whole. Our recommendations and findings were also very comprehensive in all the spheres. So we really needed to have almost a united vision between our agencies on how the recommendations and next steps could look like, because I'll talk about this in the recommendations part, but the recommendations, we worked a lot on them to make them almost in a roadmap for the government to see what are the options going forward and what are the priority areas. They were very comprehensive, meaning they're in all spheres of social protection, but they're also going from higher level priorities to more specific technical recommendations in all the aspects. Next, please. So these are actually the slides. The 3 are little slides from that workshop, 2-day workshop, which we held out of Tashkent for the counterparts discussion. And on the right, you can see the preliminary recommendations that were developed by us in consultations with the counterparts at that point. And some of the takeaways and lessons learned here are the following. We thought it was exceptionally good idea to bring the participants, and these were about 30 people from all the ministries, out of Tashkent and out of their working space, because they were actually able to concentrate on this work and participate very, very actively, because they didn't have to simultaneously do all their other work activities. This was useful and very efficient. The work itself was organized in smaller groups, and smaller groups each group had a different table, and they were working on the assessment of one of the 4 blocks. And each of them had a moderator or 2 from ILO, UNICEF, or the World Bank. And the photo you can see here is the kind of summarizing the results round table at the end of the 2nd day, where we were discussing the final preliminary recommendations of that workshop. And then another takeaway, talking about the assessment matrix, I have to say that it was one of the more challenging parts, because it's not always very straightforward for the counterparts to how to assess the programs using the assessment matrix criteria, especially once you start translating the English terminology into Russian in this case. Because, for instance, adequacy and effectiveness, which kind of mean different things in English, mean completely almost it's being comprehended as a completely the same word in Russian. And then the counterparts were getting a bit lost on how exactly to use the matrix. But one thing which was very useful is that the matrix allowed the counterparts to look at their programs, social protection programs, and the system as a whole from a very different angle, the one they probably didn't think about before. And this was one of the takeaways, that the feedback that we got from them as well, is that it was very useful because it kind of changed their perspective and they were able to rethink some of the things. So, so maybe just an idea from our team to CODI team is that assessment matrix is extremely useful because of that, but maybe you need to use it as a tool for brainstorming and consultations, and less so as a tool to actually fill out the exact points and utilize it in that way. And next, please. And I already mentioned that we tried to have it all right. We used the CODI methodology to its max. We did the mapping of all social protection programs, did the description of the policy, program design, and implementation based on modules 1.3 in the questionnaire. We did the assessment matrix, and then we drafted the report based on the report outline. Yeah, so as a result, one of the takeaways is that having it all takes time and very dedicated passion to persevere the analysis. But as a result, we were able to get a very, very rich final product, useful both for the counterparts and the international partners. And because of the comprehensiveness of this approach and the analysis, we were able to provide very thorough, systematic recommendations to the system and the programs, which were very, very much needed at that stage, and still we're in the same stage of the country's development during this rapid transition and during the social protection system development. So next, please, let's, because we don't have too much time, I want to talk about the findings and recommendations so you can actually see what richness of the tools can bring you in terms of the findings and different focus areas, and as a result, the recommendations. So you can see some of the main findings on the slide, but I just want to say that the general understanding and kind of the tradition of social protection in Uzbekistan fundamentally is that it's a system of cash transfers and benefits, and less so of labor market programs and social care services. And with labor market programs, it's kind of understandable because prior to the market transition that the country is ongoing, the system, the economy relied on kind of full employment. So there was no real need for active labor market programs like in many other countries that went through the transition in the 90s, let's say. And as for the social care services, I think it was due to the fact that the country relies heavily on the community relationship and community support. And this is why dedicated social care service programs were not as actively developed as a part of the social protection system and kind of the government's responsibility. And yet all these things have started to change and shift. And as a result, a more thorough and comprehensive full understanding of SP system was needed. So some of the findings that I want to maybe briefly talk about is the lack of a social protection strategy and the lack of strategy or policy and the institutional fragmentation. It's something that the institutional fragmentation, it's something that we're still struggling with because all the agencies, especially, social assistance is with the Ministry of Finance, the pension fund is under the Ministry of Finance, so the pensions are there. And then there is a whole bunch of labor market programs which are very actively being developed under the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relationship. And yet we all know how important it is to link the social assistance programs with labor market activation, for example, and to understand more wholesomely what types of benefits or programs or services a specific household gets from the government. Other things included, other findings included limited coverage of low-income family allowances. Child benefits and family allowances are the three programs that I mentioned, the three means-tested programs, which are the main social assistance program essentially in the country. In the last, until 2017, 2019, the coverage of these programs was reduced dramatically, and it only started to increase around 2018, very, very slowly. And we put a lot of emphasis because this was something that all of our agency found very, very problematic, that during the transition, the main social assistance program is not covering sufficient share of population. So this was one of the main findings that we kept highlighting throughout the policy dialogue, throughout the consultations, not just at the end of this process, but as we were talking with the government about the CODI assessment, but also as a part of our ongoing engagements. I mentioned the limited coordination of labor market programs. And then, yeah, we can go to the next one, Veronica, it's okay. The other ones included, no, let's talk about the recommendations now. So following this analysis, we tried to develop a comprehensive set of recommendations which would allow the government to see the system wholesomely as a one social protection system with different mechanisms which are aimed at addressing different vulnerabilities of population. And in that, of course, formulating the national social protection strategy and ensuring the coordination was completely essential. And the second one is ensuring financial stability and the fiscal space to carry out social protection programs. And we said that the comprehensive social protection public expenditure review was needed to analyze the impact and performance of existing programs and compare and benchmark the spending with other countries. In terms of the governance and the system as a whole, it wasn't only that the social protection strategy was lacking, it was also that the data availability and its quality was problematic, and the M&E system was basically non-existent. So there was no framework to think about the monitoring and especially the evaluation of different components of the system, of different programs, but also of the system as a whole. And there was also almost no complaint. There was some, but they were paper-based and kind of limited complaint mechanisms for some of the allowances and some of the programs. So these things, the data quality in the sector and the development of M&E framework were the things that were a part of the governance and efficiency of the system, but they were also about the coordination of the programs and institutions. There was essentially no place where this M&E framework could sit with, no agency or no ministry. So we kept bringing this up as a part of our dialogue, other agencies' dialogue, etc., because we were trying to make a point that you need to be able to evaluate and monitor your programs to be able to then make empirically based decisions on which programs function and which are not. And then, of course, we were making a point on expanding the need to expand the coverage and design of low-income family allowances, active labor market programs to answer the need of changing environment and changing economy, to get people to get the people to be able to get the skills kind of a future labor market, etc. We don't really have too much time to discuss all of these recommendations, and I also have another slide with the recommendations, but I just want to give you kind of a taste of which questions you can answer and what things you can think about when using CODI application to its full potential, and what types of recommendations and the thoroughness of these recommendations that one can arrive at when using it. These, as you can see, are very, very concrete policy actions. It's especially if you add a timeline of these proposed recommendations, it almost becomes a roadmap of the social protection sector development. And now these recommendations, I have to say, are being very actively used as a part of the ongoing process of the development of the social protection strategy and the complementing roadmap that is being developed. Next, please. These are some other recommendations that we made. The social care services needed development, the pensions needed expansion, and and with some additional details. Let's go to the dissemination. So I mentioned we didn't do, so for us, the dissemination and the value of this process was on the ongoing interaction with counterparts and among the donors to get on the same page on what the scope of social protection is, what functions, what doesn't function well, to align position among the development partners. So we, especially because of how long the process ended up taking, we didn't do a massive dissemination event at the end, but rather we did a lot of policy dialogue at all the stages of the CODI process throughout this 2+ years. And I would like to emphasize something that Ade was also mentioning, that this process and CODI assessment is also meant, it's one of the main things, right, um, to align the donor coordination positions and to bring more coherence to the donors and international community when thinking about the social protection sector. And I have to say, this was one of the main outcomes of this process. CODI contributed a great deal to the donor coordination, which was extremely much needed on the ground, given the rapidly developing social protection agenda as a part of the reform agenda and the transition to market economy. But then also, as we all know, COVID happened. So we had to work even more closely together with counterparts and between different agencies to develop the social protection response, to support the government in developing the social protection response and then its implementation. And my personal perception is that because by the time the COVID happened, we were already 1.5 years or so in this process, and we went through several iterations of recommendations, discussions with different counterparts, we were able to answer the requests and urgent needs that were arising at that time from the government much more effectively because we have gone through this process. So we were able to show kind of a united front in front of the client at that point because we already understood really well what was working in social protection, in delivery chains of different programs, etc. Next, please. So as a result of this kind of ongoing dialogue and the momentum on social protection, some of the follow-ups were rather high level and very important. And I listed some of them here. Some of our recommendations follow-up has been that in February this year, 2021, the president signed a decree on the development of the social protection strategy and the accompanying roadmap, which is now being developed, led by the Ministry of Finance, and with the support from ILO and other international organizations as well. It's a cross-ministerial working group. And the plan is that the strategy is to be adopted by the end of this year. And this also, you can imagine how many different ministries need to participate in this process. And the fact that the UN agencies and the World Bank have been through the CODI process, we are able to navigate the process of development, this SP strategy much better, because we understand where the strengths are of different agencies and how to better organize the working process to organize stakeholder consultations and do all the things necessary for this development, social protection strategy development. Another thing is a very big development in the country is the single registry, which is being piloted and now actually nationally rolled out, which also Ministry of Finance is in charge of, with the support from UNICEF and the World Bank. This will bring the strengthening and accountability improvement of social benefits, starting from the 3 main low-income family allowances. It was piloted in October 2019 and rolled out in the country last autumn, from September to December 2020. Region by region, it was rolled out in the country. So from community-based targeting of the main social assistance programs, the country moved to and paper-based, community-based targeted programs. The country has been moving and now moved to the fully digitized process of the single registry and the allocation of social benefits through the single registry. Another thing which is not here but is also, it was a part of our recommendations, but especially so during the COVID social protection response. The main social assistance programs have been very, very massively expanded. Basically, they doubled it last year, which was also it was one of the recommendations. The coverage was not sufficient, but it was heard and used. This program was used as a tool for COVID response. I'll talk about the COVID response in a bit. And next, please. I mentioned the challenges, right? It's just that if you want to do everything, it's going to be time consuming. And then you need to align the positions and recommendations because you're producing one report and one piece. We also had some challenges with data availability. And then we also had to do this balance of different positions and insights and assessments of different views, essentially based on international comparisons. So it's a very delicate process, which is doable. We did it. Just takes time and dedication. And I want to leave a few minutes for questions in case there are any, but let's go to COVID response, just because the CODI team asked us about the COVID response in Uzbekistan and how the CODI was used. And I actually think it's very interesting example of how Uzbekistan used its social protection programs, the existing ones, and created new ones as a response to COVID pandemic. But before I talk about what they did, I want to say that it kind of, the timeline worked really well and in our favor and the government's favor, in the sense that we finished this very massive exercise right before the pandemic started. So all of us, counterparts and the international community, had a very good understanding and the empirical evidence of what the programs are, how well they're functioning, what the delivery chains are. It's something Ade was also mentioning. You need to understand not just what the programs exist, but also what are the exact, delivery chain bottlenecks that potentially exist. Because in the crisis times, you need to expand the programs, and for that you need to be able to react very fast, and you really don't have time to figure out what is functioning and what is not. So by that point, we kind of knew what we're able to scale up and what is not as efficient, for example. And to that, the CODI, of course, contributed a lot. So what the country did during the COVID response time. So there were several things done. First of all, the low-income family allowance programs, the 3 programs that I mentioned, the coverage was expanded several times. And first time in spring, they did the extension of benefits without the re-enrollment to also align with the COVID reality and people not being able to go outside, etc. And then they also expanded the coverage several more times. And I think that before the pandemic, the coverage was about 500,000 households. And by the end of 2020, and this was the planned coverage for the year, and by the end of 2020, the coverage was twice that. It was more than 1 million households. And they kept expanding. So it was not only the kind of a temporary expansion, it was also intended to stay like that in expanded manner going forward, at least some years. Then the public works programs. The public works programs were one of the first programs which worked very efficiently under this new realities, I would say. First of all, the coverage was also significantly expanded, but also the Public Works Agency and the Ministry of, under the guidance from the Ministry of Labor, expanded the areas of work for public works to include some of the kind of COVID response supportive types of works like sanitization, or to, for example, in Uzbekistan, you were not able for a very extended period of time last spring, you were not able to leave your mahalla, your little kind of district was not allowed. So they mobilized this mobile supermarkets, let's say. It's like a little car which comes to your mahalla, and then you can buy some produce, some milk, some basic things. So they were also using this, the public works programs to do that, and some other types of areas of work which were aligned with the new realities. Then they also expanded unemployment benefits and some of the active labor market programs later in the year, expanded the coverage and introduced provisional procedures so people could apply more easily. And these 3 programs, low-income family allowances, public works, and unemployment benefits, and active labor market programs, were based on the existing system programs. They were just expanded and used in a disaster responsive manner. And then several new programs were introduced, and mainly the one-off benefit, which was distributed several times last year, and actually Round is planned for this year in the light of the recent expansion of COVID cases in the country, is one of benefits for this vulnerable households. And this was done through the community-based targeting. And they had a very, very high coverage of this one-off benefits. There were one-off benefits for all the families in the list in maybe June or July last year. And then by September, by the school year, they also did another one-off benefit, but only for children from the families in this list, kind of for the start of the school year. And here I have to say that the country relied on a very, very efficient way and their strength essentially to be able to do the community-based targeting, because that is something that they're very good at, very efficient, and that is something that worked really fast when they realized that just the expansion of low-income family allowances is not enough, because people have several other vulnerabilities. They might not necessarily fall into the category of low-income family and not necessarily qualify for that, but they also needed support. And the next final slide is that the COVID response ended up being 0.44% of the GDP, which is a very significant share of spending, because for the same year or the previous year, 2019, the social protection budget was just under 1% of GDP, the standard social protection program financing. So this is basically a half of the annual social protection program. And this is the COVID response expansion. These are all the programs financed on top of the other existing social protection regular programs. I want to wrap up here because we have very little time left, but the next slide is very pretty with QR codes to the Russian and English version of the CODI assessment in Uzbekistan. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marina. And yes, indeed, we have a few questions. So let me go through them. We have a little bit on how to do CODI and more general ones. So we can start with a question about any tips on how to evaluate efficiency if the government doesn't have a disaggregated financial data by program scheme. I'm currently using CODI to collect financial data in a specific country, but the government only has expenditure data disaggregated by ministry and not by program. So, sorry, let me mention that it's been answered. So any ideas that you could share there?
I can try actually with the head of my previous work on Aspire, even more than the CODI, because I used to work in the Aspire team, focusing on administrative data on spending and beneficiary numbers for the whole world. And this was one of the big issues that we had, that the consultants were not able to, or the country teams were not able to get the program level data. I think the answer here is the policy dialogue to convince the government that the way to go is into the program specific expenditure data and try to get, at least for some of them, that expenditure data. In my experience, in the countries where that is not possible and the data is kind of by ministry, for the main programs, for the bigger ones, you can still get this information. So it's harder to answer without knowing the country specifically, which country it is. But I remember that there were cases where the programs were by ministry, but still for the main programs, either because they're donor funded or for some other reasons, the financial data for the biggest social protection programs was available. But it's a great question. It's really challenging. It's not straightforward.
Thank you. I know you were the right person.
And if I may add to that, again, a very good question. Something that I think quite a few CODI implementations will run into. I'm having a similar issue of implementing the CODI tool in Libya. I mentioned this at the previous webinar that we had. whereby most of the issue is not actually that the data isn't there. It's a question of transparency and trust with how this data is going to be used. And so most of the work that, and I'm not sure if this will be helpful, but most of the efforts that we had was to convince the government from the onset that the diagnostic tool, or this assessment tool, review tool, however we want to call it, is not meant to compare one country to another. It is not meant to judge per se how well the government is doing. And that led us to receiving a lot of financial information on programs that was actually quite outdated, but that still was helpful for us to understand if it was reaching the intended objectives, if the coverage and incidents and all these aspects were easy to identify. But as Marina mentioned, through the Aspire database, that's been a constant issue, and we can take this offline as well. So please feel free to message us. Even on the ispatools.org website, there is a click where you can contact us, and we can try to help with this aspect a bit more, because we do have colleagues who are working on this specifically, and we can always piggyback on other teams that are trying to answer these questions, because this is one of the most important questions that World Bank, even analytics or operations, always deals with.
Thank you. We have a few other questions. Here's another one for Marina. I understand why CODI was selected in the case of Uzbekistan, but could you elaborate for other colleagues and participants maybe why the assessment-based national dialogue was not possible in the case of Uzbekistan? And this is also related to another question that was asked in a similar case about the differences between the assessment-based national dialogue tool from the ILO and the differences or value added from CODI. So again, a question for the both of you, and I can also complement.
Actually, just quickly, I wish our ILO colleague was able to join us today, because she would have a better answer than we do. But the CODI tool was actually developed jointly with ILO. So it's one of the tools that not only with ILO, with many other organizations, and we are the co-sponsors of it, the World Bank and the ILO. And I believe, I'm not entirely sure if the assessment-based national dialogue is more concentrated on labor programs and social insurance. I'm not entirely sure, but even ILO uses CODI quite thoroughly, because it provides a broader look at the system. But I may be mistaken. Marina?
I mean, that's a question to ILO colleagues, I think. They would know better. But my understanding is that, again, because ILO contributed to CODI, CODI just has a wider angle of how you look at the system as a whole. The delivery chain aspects of it, etc. So it's kind of wider. It gives you a more comprehensive view of this. That's my understanding, at least.
Yeah, and just to complement, I think the value added is also the interagency aspect. So in that sense, you do get feedback also from other agencies and what their strength is and focus is, and you can complement it. And the tools are flexible enough that you can complement it in any way. We also have a tool in development, which is the social protection policy options tool, being led by the ILO, and I think they also have used some part of the ABND tool to develop it.
Can I just add something? It's not necessarily to this question, just something I wanted to mention. So we keep saying that it's a very comprehensive tool, but you know, what does it really mean? And I didn't really know how to specifically answer this question until I started saying that you guys are working on the tools for disaster responsive assessment now. And I thought this is great because we're in the process now of finalizing the assessment of disaster responsiveness of social protection systems in Central Asia. And as we were working on this task, I kept thinking, if only we had a way of structured thinking about this assessment like we did for CODI, it would have been so much easier. I mean, it would take 2 years, but you would at least have all the questions you need to answer, and you were like, not, you know that you're not missing any parts of this question. You might pick the ones that are more related to your question or your focus, etc., but at least you know the scope of them. So I was thinking, okay, if only we had something like CODI, but for disaster responsiveness, it would have just simplified our thinking, the team's thinking about how to approach this assessment. So now, as you were saying this, I thought, okay, this is great because this it just helps you structure your thinking in a very comprehensive and holistic way. And then you can pick up the parts that are more relevant to your specific questions. We had a huge knowledge gap. We didn't have a thorough assessment, so we went with everything essentially. But then for countries where there was something done more recently, you can skip some of the parts and focus more on counterpart engagement or specific aspects of public works using public works tools, etc. Yeah, over.
That's a good point, and thank you, Marina. Initially the idea was that all the partners wanted a tool on disaster risk and social protection. And all the agencies have some sort of assessments already, but it's not a thorough tool. And so the idea was, instead of developing its own thing, where in any case you will still want to link it to CODI somehow, why not just link it from the onset? Using all the information that's already there, that took quite a lot of time to be carefully sort of synchronized and summarized, and just have a module that is linked to it. And so that's the idea. And we will be reconstituting the CODI working group this fall to look at what has been worked on already. So it's the shock responsiveness disability, which, as we all know, does require quite a lot of attention. And we've seen during COVID that a few responses have been, would have benefited more had we had more on disability as well, and the gender aspect. And this is something that has been brought up several times. It's also a priority of many donor agencies. It's a priority of many governments. And so we're trying to keep it as timely as possible, keeping this tool updated, but at the same time, not losing this depth, and trying to link it to these agendas and these important assessments that are, again, demand-based. So governments are coming to us saying, WFP has one assessment tool on of course, on disaster. You guys have another one, IDBS another one. It also depends on what your core work is, but linking it to the delivery chain is actually the essential part. And so it's been good to have more of a quorum of our partners, again, working on something that can be useful for it's a public good. And so in the end, yeah.
Just being aware of time, we've reached the hour, so thank you so much for everyone who participated. If anyone has a few minutes to stay, we have a few more questions, but just wanted to thank everyone who participated and joined us, and special thanks to Marina Nadea and the ISPA.org team, the socialprotection.org team, who has kindly supported us throughout the webinar. I'll just put the thank you slide, but we can finish with just a few more questions. One to Adea. Can these performance criteria also be used as guiding principles for harmonization of an SP system?
This is a question that comes up actually quite a lot. Harmonization can mean several things. So harmonization of the SP system from the government side, harmonization of donors to assist in the SP system. Exactly. Just by default, the tool itself is a harmonized tool because it was conducted using a lot of development agencies and looking at sort of what governments are dealing with, what their priorities are going forward. But I would be happy to talk about this because this is a topic that can take quite a long time to discuss, but I'm happy to talk about this offline.
And then
I also
one,
saw Salia's
okay.
question, but I cannot find it anymore in the chat.
And Karina, I think I saw a question from Karina. Yes, we will absolutely have more webinars in the future where we discuss the new changes to CODI. Absolutely, that's our key. That's our key bread and butter, especially because
Nadalia is
it is public good.
asking, how is benchmarking differ from comparison?
So what we mean by benchmarking is, yes, we do look at the criteria that were developed using 20 plus agencies to come up with this assessment criteria. But it's not meant to, let's say, compare one country with its neighbor country. But these are preset criteria using social protection system experiences throughout the world. And it wasn't easy. And it's always one thing that can be a bit contentious. But it's supposed to showcase where the country is standing against these, let's say, more so idealistic criteria and how they can improve on these aspects, as opposed to saying, okay, Philippines has done this, Uzbekistan has done this, you should go towards that. But it's more
kind of
objective in that sense.
Yourself with yourself in the future,
yes, exactly.
Rather than comparing across the countries.
Exactly, and that's
it's not easy for sure, but it's more like, I know where I am at 3 out of 5, and 5 is not a specific country, it's more like how I envision my own development, the country's development going
exactly
forward.
And what's actually, sometimes there are countries that have done CODI in different points in time. They've gone back after 5 years or 6 years and done just a rapid one, just to see if any of the recommendations that were brought forward and were implemented have made a dent or an impact into those assessments of the country itself. So it is a sort of a tool to assess a point in time of where the country stands, and it can be applied after again. So there's no way, and there's no need to stop it from being applied again. Of course, there's resources that are needed and team that is needed, but it can be a more rapid one in the future if you already have the sort of the baseline information. So it can be a self-assessment tool in that sense.
Precisely, and just to add to that, and further clarify, a 5 and a 5 doesn't mean necessarily the same for both countries, because each country is tied to the context, and since it's a self-assessment, it's but mentioning that, one can also bring more specific examples from other contexts just as reference. Thank you so much. Just a quick question to Marina, if you have data about Uzbekistan, such as types of schemes, rate, coverage, and population. I believe these can be found in the report, or
they are in the CODI report.
Yep.
We have, I mean, if I understand the question right, the social protection data is in annexes of the CODI report, and kind of the national data is in the World Bank's databases like WDI, population, and etc.
I think we've gone through all of the questions. Oh, and the sources for the theory of change. Again, this should be in the tool, since each agency also and each expert that was in the team that developed the tool brought in their expertise and knowledge. They should also be included there. So in the both, you can find both in the ISPA website, ispatools.org. Let me just go back to the nice QR codes and in the CODI report. I think we've gone through everything.
I want to thank Anna Sukhova for making this possible. I didn't know you can put a QR code to the report in the slide. It's like a whole new level of presentation making. Thanks, Anna.
So once again, thank you everybody who joined, and thank you for all of your questions, and special thanks to Marina, and hope we we have more webinars in the future, and stay tuned. Go visit our websites, go check the report. And everything will also be available at socialprotection.org.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.